Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished welding another support beam on his mining platform. The asteroid belt was quiet today, just the way he liked it. No corporate ships breathing down his neck. No government inspectors asking questions. Just him, his tools, and the endless field of space rocks that kept him fed. The communication system crackled to life, interrupting his work. Jake almost ignored it. Most transmissions out here were either spam advertisements or emergency broadcasts that didn't concern him. But something about the signal made him pause. It was coming through on multiple frequencies at once, which meant it was important. He floated over to his control panel and activated the receiver. The screen flickered, then showed an image that made him drop his welding torch. A woman appeared on the screen, but calling her a woman felt wrong. She was tall, maybe 7 feet, with skin that seemed to shimmer between blue and silver. Her eyes were larger than human eyes, a deep purple color that seemed to hold starlight. When she spoke, her voice carried a strange musical quality that made Jake's chest feel tight. "I am Queen Lyrillith of the Zephyrian Empire," she said. "I address all civilizations of the galaxy with a request that will determine the future of my people." Jake had heard of the Zephyrians. Everyone had. They controlled a huge chunk of the galaxy and had technology that made human science look like cave paintings. Their ships could cross between star systems in days instead of months. Their cities floated in space without any visible support. They were the kind of advance that made other species feel primitive. "For 3,000 years I have ruled alone," the queen continued. "But my bloodline must continue and my empire needs stability. I seek a mate, but not just any mate. My biology requires someone with very specific traits. Most beings in the galaxy cannot provide what I need." The transmission showed images of the Zephyrian homeworld, cities that sparkled like jewels, floating gardens that defied gravity, and technology that seemed like magic. Jake had seen pictures before, but never this clear. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. "I have created tests," Queen Lyrillith said. "Any being who believes they can meet my requirements may come to Zephyria and undergo these trials. The rewards for success are beyond imagination. Planetary governorships, advanced technology, wealth that could buy star systems, but more than that, the chosen mate will help shape the future of galactic civilization." The Queen's image seemed to look directly at Jake through the screen. "I do not expect many to attempt this challenge. The requirements are unusual, but for the right being, the one who can truly connect with my essence, a new future awaits." The transmission ended, leaving Jake staring at a blank screen. He replayed it 3 times, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. A queen of one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy was asking for a husband, and she was offering rewards that could change someone's entire life. Jake laughed at himself. What was he thinking? He was a human, barely 33 years old, with calloused hands and scars from 100 mining accidents. He had dropped out of college to join the Marines, then left the Marines to become an asteroid miner. He was about as far from royalty as someone could get, but something about the Queen's words stuck with him. The way she said unusual requirements and the right being. Most species would probably send their best and brightest, their most educated and refined individuals. But what if that wasn't what she was looking for? Over the next few days, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the broadcast. He watched news reports about the galactic response. The Altarians were sending a team of their most brilliant scientists. The Krugan Empire was preparing their greatest warriors. The telepathic Valdris were selecting their most gifted mind readers. Every major civilization was treating this like a competition to show off their best specimens. Jake read about beings with lifespans of thousands of years, individuals who could solve mathematical equations in their heads that would take human computers hours to process, warriors who could lift vehicles with their bare hands. What chance did a human have against competition like that? Jake had been good in the Marines, sure. He could fix almost any piece of equipment, survive in harsh conditions, and keep his head cool under pressure. But compared to beings who had centuries of education and genetic advantages, he felt like a child trying to compete with adults. Still, something nagged at him. He kept replaying the Queen's words, especially the part about unusual requirements. What if everyone else was thinking wrong? What if the Queen wasn't looking for the most advanced or powerful being in the galaxy? Jake made his decision on a Tuesday morning while eating synthetic eggs and watching another news report about failed candidates. A group of Altarian geniuses had just returned from Zephyria, looking defeated and confused. The reporter mentioned that over 200 beings from 30 different species had already attempted the Queen's tests, and all had failed. He turned off the news and started calculating. He had enough savings to book passage to Zephyria if he sold his mining operation. It would cost him everything he had worked for over the past 5 years. If he failed, he would come back broke and probably become a joke across human space. But if he didn't try, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened. Jake had never been the type to play it safe. That's why he left Earth for the asteroid belt in the first place. He preferred taking risks to living with regrets. Jake started making preparations that afternoon. He contacted a buyer for his mining equipment and platform. He booked passage on a cargo ship heading towards Zephyrien space. He sent a message to his sister on Mars, telling her he was taking an extended vacation. He didn't tell anyone his real plan. When his friends at the mining station asked where he was going, Jake just said he needed a change of scenery. They wished him luck and promised to keep his favorite bar stool warm. 3 days later, Jake was on a transport ship heading toward the center of the galaxy. He had one bag of personal belongings, enough credits for the journey, and a growing feeling that he was either about to make the biggest mistake of his life or discover something amazing. As the ship jumped to faster-than-light speed, Jake looked out the window at the stars stretching into lines of light. Somewhere out there was a queen who had lived for 3,000 years, looking for someone who could understand her in a way that the galaxy's most advanced beings could not. Jake Morrison, former Marine and asteroid miner, was going to find out if a simple human could be that someone. The cargo ship Dancing Bear was not designed for passenger comfort. Jake spent most of the 3-week journey to Zephyrien space, sleeping in a storage compartment that smelled like machine oil and recycled air. The other passengers were mostly traders and diplomats who looked at him with barely hidden amusement when they learned why he was traveling. "You're going to try for the Queen?" asked Dr. Helen Carter, a human xenobiologist heading to a research station. "Jake, no offense, but do you know what you're up against?" "I've read reports about some of the beings who've already failed. There was a Valdris telepath who could read thoughts from 3 star systems away, a Krugan warrior who once held off an entire army single-handedly, an Altarian mathematician who helped design their latest starship engines." Jake stirred his synthetic coffee and shrugged. "Yeah, I heard about them. Pretty impressive." "Impressive?" Helen laughed, but not unkindly. "Jake, these beings have capabilities that we can barely understand. What makes you think you have something they don't?" It was a fair question, and Jake had been asking himself the same thing for days. "I don't know if I do," he said honestly, "but something about that broadcast felt right, I guess. Like she was talking directly to me." Helen studied his face for a moment. "You know what the failure rate is?" 100%. Every single candidate has been rejected, and most of them came back pretty messed up. The tests do something to people. Change them. Jake had heard the rumors. Beings returning from Zephyria weren't just disappointed. They seemed broken somehow. Confident warriors becoming timid. Brilliant scientists unable to focus on simple problems. Whatever Queen Lyrolith's tests involved, they left marks on people that went deeper than pride. "Maybe that's because they were trying to be something they're not," Jake said. "Maybe the Queen is looking for something simpler." The ship made several stops on its way to Zephyrien space. At each station, Jake heard more stories about failed candidates. On Kepler Station, he met a Thurian merchant who had witnessed one of the tests. "Strangest thing I ever saw," the merchant said, his forearms gesturing as he talked. "This Altarian brilliant fellow supposedly had an IQ that our computers couldn't measure. Went into the testing chamber confident as could be. Came out 3 hours later crying like a hatchling. Kept saying he couldn't understand the questions, but the questions were simple. Basic math, simple logic puzzles, things a child could answer." Jake filed that information away. Simple questions that brilliant beings couldn't answer. What did that mean? At the next stop, Frontier Base, Jake overheard 2 Krugan officers discussing their empire's failed attempts. "3 of our finest warriors," one was saying. "Each one strong enough to crack ship armor with their bare hands. The first test broke all of them. Not physically, you understand. Something else. They came back talking about facing themselves in a mirror that showed truth. Said they couldn't handle what they saw. A mirror that showed truth." Jake thought about that as the ship continued its journey. What would he see in such a mirror? A failed college student who ran away to join the military, a former Marine who couldn't handle peacetime and escaped to the asteroid belt, a man who had never formed lasting relationships because he was better at dealing with machines than people. Maybe the difference was that Jake already knew those things about himself. He had never pretended to be more than he was. As they got closer to Zephyrian space, the other passengers began treating Jake differently. Instead of amusement, he saw something like pity in their eyes. Dr. Carter started avoiding him at meals. The ship's captain, a gruff woman named Rodriguez, cornered him in the cargo bay one evening. "Son, I've been running cargo routes for 20 years, she said. "I've seen a lot of good people make bad decisions. This thing you're doing, it's going to end badly. These alien queens don't pick humans. We're not advanced enough, not special enough. You're going to embarrass yourself and our entire species." Jake appreciated her concern, but it only strengthened his resolve. "Captain, with respect, maybe that's exactly why she might pick me. Because I'm not trying to prove how advanced or special I am." When they finally reached Zephyrian space, Jake got his first real look at what he was up against. The ships around them were works of art as much as vehicles. Sleek vessels that seemed to bend light around them. Massive cruisers that looked like they were carved from single pieces of crystal. Small fighters that moved with impossible grace. The Zephyrian homeworld appeared on the view screen like a blue and silver jewel. 3 moons orbited around it, each one covered with cities that sparkled in the starlight. Jake could see space elevators stretching from the planet's surface to orbital platforms, and rings of stations that must have housed millions of beings. At immigration, Jake was processed by a Zephyrian official who looked like he was carved from living marble. The alien's fingers were longer than human fingers, ending in points that glowed softly blue. When he looked at Jake's documentation, his expression didn't change, but Jake caught a subtle shake of the head. "Purpose of visit?" the official asked in perfect English. "I'm here to answer Queen Lyrillith's call," Jake said. The official's glow dimmed slightly. "I see. And you are aware of the current success rate of such attempts?" 0%. "Yeah, I know. And you still wish to proceed?" "Yes, sir." The official stamped Jake's documents with what might have been resignation. "You will be transported to the capital city of Lyrillith Prime. The testing facility is in the Royal District. I wish you well, human Jake Morrison." The transport to the planet's surface gave Jake a better view of Zephyrian civilization. The cities were impossible by human standards. Buildings that twisted upward like living vines. Bridges made of what looked like solid light. Parks where the trees grew in geometric patterns that shifted and changed as he watched. At the testing facility, Jake joined a line of other candidates who had recently arrived. He was the only human, which didn't surprise him. The others were impressive even by galactic standards. A being made of what looked like living crystal that hummed with internal energy. A creature with 6 arms and skin that shifted through different colors. Something that might have been pure energy held together by a containment field. They all looked at Jake with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. He was clearly the least impressive candidate in the group. No special abilities, no advanced technology, no exotic biology. Just a human in simple clothes carrying a single bag. But as Jake waited his turn, he noticed something interesting. The candidates who went in before him came out looking confused and defeated, just like all the others he had heard about. Whatever was happening in those testing chambers, it wasn't what anyone expected. When a Zephyrian attendant called his name, Jake stood up and walked toward the chamber doors. Behind him, he heard one of the other candidates laugh. "At least this won't take long," the crystal being said in a voice like wind chimes. "Humans barely qualify as sentient." Jake paused at the chamber entrance and looked back. "You know," he said calmly, "that's probably exactly the kind of attitude that's been getting everyone in trouble." The doors closed behind him, and Jake found himself alone in a room that seemed to stretch into infinity in all directions. Somewhere in this place, he was about to discover whether a simple human could succeed where the galaxy's most advanced beings had failed. The testing chamber was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The walls seemed to be made of flowing water that reflected not his image but his thoughts. The floor felt solid under his feet, but when he looked down he could see stars swimming beneath the surface like living things. A voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was Queen Lyrillith, but different from the broadcast, warmer, more personal, as if she was speaking directly into his mind. "Welcome, Jake Morrison of Earth. You are the first human to attempt these trials. I'm curious to see what your species will show me. Jake looked around the impossible room. Your Majesty, I have to admit, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here. That is perhaps the most honest thing any candidate has said upon entering this chamber, the Queen's voice replied. And Jake could hear something like amusement in it. The first test is simple. You must find your way through the labyrinth of truth. It will show you what you fear most and what you desire most. Many candidates become lost between these two extremes. The room shifted around Jake. Walls rose from the flowing floor, creating passages that stretched in impossible directions. Some paths sloped upward toward bright lights, others descended into shadows that seemed to whisper his name. Jake had expected something like this. The merchant on Kepler Station had mentioned tests that got inside people's heads. But instead of trying to figure out the right path, Jake simply started walking down the corridor directly in front of him. The labyrinth responded immediately. The walls began showing him images. His father's face disappointed when Jake dropped out of college. His drill sergeant screaming at him during basic training. The empty apartment he came home to after every failed relationship. Jake kept walking. These were his fears, sure, but they were also just parts of his life. He had made peace with most of them years ago. The images shifted to show him desires. Wealth beyond imagining. A house on a beautiful world with a family waiting for him. Recognition as a hero of humanity. Power to reshape the galaxy according to his will. Jake paused at this section, not because the visions tempted him, but because they felt hollow. He had never wanted any of those things, not really. What he wanted was simpler and harder to define. Connection, purpose, the feeling that his life mattered to someone. Interesting. Queen Lyrillith's voice murmured. You do not run from your fears or chase after grand desires. Why? Because they're just thoughts, Jake said aloud as he continued walking. I am what I am. These things don't change that. The labyrinth dissolved around him and Jake found himself in a new space. This one looked like a library, but the books were floating in the air, their pages turning by themselves. Ancient symbols and equations drifted through the space like snow. The second test, the Queen announced. Communication with the archive crystals. These artifacts contain the accumulated knowledge of my people. They respond only to minds that can touch them properly. Most candidates try to impress the crystals with their intelligence or overwhelm them with their psychic abilities. Jake approached one of the floating crystals. It was about the size of his fist, glowing with internal blue light. When he reached out to touch it, the crystal pulsed brighter. Immediately, Jake's mind was flooded with information. Mathematical concepts that hurt to think about. Scientific principles that seemed to violate everything he knew about physics. Historical events spanning millions of years. It was too much, too fast, like trying to drink from a fire hose. Other candidates had probably tried to process all this information to prove they could handle the crystal's knowledge. Jake did something different. He stopped trying to understand and instead just listened. Not to the content, but to the rhythm underneath it, the pattern that connected all the flowing information. The crystal calmed. The flood of data slowed to a trickle, then organized itself into something Jake could actually comprehend. It wasn't giving him advanced knowledge. It was teaching him how to learn from it. The difference was subtle but important. You do not try to conquer the crystal, the Queen observed. You ask it to teach you. I'm not smart enough to conquer something like this, Jake said honestly. But I can learn if it's willing to teach. The library faded and Jake found himself in a third space. This one was simpler. Just a comfortable chair facing another chair. In the second chair sat Queen Lyrillith herself. She was even more beautiful in person than she had been in the broadcast. Her skin seemed to contain its own light source, shifting between blue and silver like liquid metal. Her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of experience and wisdom. When she looked at Jake, he felt like she could see straight through to his soul. The final test, she said, her voice now coming from her physical form instead of the air around them. A direct connection between our minds. This is where all the others have failed. They come to me with thoughts full of how impressive they are, how much they can offer me, how they will help me rule the galaxy. Their minds are loud with ambition and pride. Jake settled into his chair and looked at the Queen. What do you want me to do? Simply be yourself. Open your mind to mine and let me see who you truly are. Jake felt the mental connection form like a bridge between them. It was strange but not uncomfortable, like having someone else's thoughts gently mixing with his own. He didn't try to hide anything or present himself as more than he was. Queen Lyrillith's mind touched his, and Jake gasped. The sheer weight of her experience was staggering. 3,000 years of ruling an empire, making decisions that affected billions of lives, bearing the loneliness of absolute power. She had seen species rise and fall, watched civilizations make the same mistakes over and over, felt the burden of trying to guide the galaxy towards something better. But underneath all that cosmic responsibility, Jake sensed something that surprised him. She was tired, not physically, but emotionally exhausted from centuries of dealing with beings who saw her only as a means to power or knowledge. Everyone who approached her wanted something from her. No one had ever simply wanted to know her. Through their connection, Jake felt the Queen exploring his mind in return. She saw his memories of growing up in a blue-collar family on Earth, his struggles in school, his time in the Marines, his years alone in the asteroid belt. She experienced his failures and small triumphs, his loneliness and his stubborn refusal to give up hope. "You have no grand ambitions," she said, her mental voice filled with wonder. "You do not seek to use me for power or advancement. You simply wish to understand." "You seemed lonely in that broadcast," Jake said through their connection. "I know what that feels like." The Queen's mind recoiled slightly, not in rejection but in surprise. "In 3,000 years you are the first being to see past my crown to the person underneath. Others see the eternal Queen, the ruler of the Zephyrian Empire, the key to galactic power. You see Lyrillith, who has spent centuries wondering if anyone would ever see her as simply herself." Jake felt something shift in the mental connection. The formal barrier between candidate and Queen began to dissolve, replaced by something more personal. Two minds recognizing each other across the vast differences of species and experience. "I have lived so long," she continued, "that I had begun to doubt whether genuine connection was possible. My people revere me but do not know me. Other species see me as a tool for their advancement. But you approach me as one lonely being reaching out to another." The mental connection deepened, and Jake felt the Queen's surprise turn to something warmer. For the first time in centuries, she was experiencing a mind that touched hers without trying to take something from it. "The tests are complete," Queen Lyrillith said aloud, breaking the mental connection gently. "You have passed all 3 trials, Jake Morrison. Not through superior intelligence or ability, but through something far rarer. Authentic humanity." Jake blinked, finding himself back in the original testing chamber. "I passed?" The Queen stood, and even though she was much taller than him, Jake didn't feel small in her presence. "You did more than pass. You showed me something I thought was lost forever, the possibility of genuine connection without artifice or agenda." As the chamber doors opened, Jake could hear surprised voices from the waiting area. After hundreds of failures, someone had finally succeeded. But as he looked at Queen Lyrillith's face, Jake realized that the real test hadn't been whether he was worthy of her. It had been whether she could find someone willing to see her as more than a queen. And somehow a simple human from the asteroid belt had been exactly what she was looking for. The news that a human had passed Queen Lyrillith's test spread through the galaxy faster than light itself. Within hours, Jake found himself at the center of a political storm that he had never imagined possible. The Zephyrian court was in chaos. Ancient nobles who had served the Queen for centuries struggled to understand how a primitive human could succeed where their finest candidates had failed. Some saw it as a sign that their understanding of superiority was flawed. Others viewed it as an insult to their entire civilization. Lord Zenthar, the Queen's chief advisor, met with Jake in a private chamber within the royal palace. The old Zephyrian's skin had faded to a pale silver with age, and his movements carried the weight of centuries. "You must understand the position you have placed us in," Zenthar said carefully. "Our Queen has ruled for 3 millennia. Every decision she makes affects billions of lives across hundreds of star systems. Her choice of mate will influence the genetic and political future of our empire." Jake sat across from the advisor, still wearing the simple clothes he had arrived in. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just answered her call." "Yes, and that is perhaps what troubles many of us most," Zenthar replied. "You have no political training, no understanding of galactic diplomacy, no experience with the responsibilities that come with royal partnership. Yet our Queen has chosen you above beings with centuries of education and breeding for leadership." Through the chamber's windows, Jake could see the Zephyrian capital city stretching toward the horizon. Flying vehicles moved between the crystal spires like schools of fish, and he could see the orbital elevators reaching up into space like pillars holding up the sky. "What does she need from a partner?" Jake asked. "Really, I mean, not the political stuff, but what does Lyralith actually need?" Zenthar paused, considering the question. "That is not something I had thought to ask. The Queen has always seemed complete unto herself, but if I am honest, she has seemed different in recent years. More distant, less engaged with the daily governance of the Empire. Some of us wondered if the burden of immortality was beginning to weigh on her." That evening, Jake was invited to dine with Queen Lyralith in her private quarters. The room was surprisingly simple compared to the grand throne rooms and public spaces he had seen. Comfortable furniture, books written in various galactic languages, and large windows showing the stars. "How are you handling the attention?" Lyralith asked as they shared a meal of foods Jake couldn't identify but found surprisingly familiar in taste. "It's a lot," Jake admitted. "Back home, the most political thing I ever did was vote in local elections. Now I've got diplomats from a dozen species wanting to talk to me about trade agreements and defensive pacts." Lyralith smiled, an expression that transformed her otherworldly beauty into something warmer and more approachable. "They see you as a path to influencing me. It is one of the prices of power that everyone who approaches you wants something. Is that why you've been alone all this time? Because you couldn't trust anyone's motives?" The Queen set down her eating utensil and looked out at the stars. "Partly, but also because I had begun to believe that true connection was impossible for someone like me. How do you build a relationship with someone when you can live for tens of thousands of years, and they will be gone in a few decades? How do you trust emotions when beings will say anything to gain access to your power?" Jake thought about that. Maybe you don't build it to last forever. Maybe you build it to be real right now. An interesting perspective from a species with such short lifespans. "We have to make things count quickly," Jake said. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect situations." Over the following days, Jake began to understand the complexity of what he had stepped into. Messages arrived from Earth's government, suddenly very interested in the human who had become the galaxy's most important person overnight. Corporate representatives offered him massive contracts to endorse their products. News agencies bid against each other for exclusive interview rights. But the most challenging communications came from other humans. Some praised him as a hero who had elevated humanity's status in the galaxy. Others criticized him for abandoning his own species to join an alien empire. A few suggested that he was betraying humanity by sharing advanced technology and political influence with non-humans. Jake met with Dr. Carter, the xenobiologist from the cargo ship, who had remained on Zephyria to study the outcome of the tests. "I have to ask," she said as they walked through one of the palace gardens. "Are you sure about this? I mean, really sure? You're talking about marrying someone who's lived longer than human civilization, someone who could probably destroy our entire solar system if she wanted to." "She won't," Jake said confidently. "How can you know that?" Jake paused by a fountain that seemed to be made of liquid light. "Because I've been inside her mind. I've felt what she feels. Helen, she's not some cosmic force or political entity. She's a person who's been alone for longer than we can imagine, trying to do the right thing for billions of people while never having anyone who understands the weight of that responsibility." "But what about the practical issues? The genetic differences, the lifespan disparity, the political implications?" "We'll figure it out as we go," Jake said. "That's what humans do, right? We adapt." Queen Lyralith found him that evening in the palace library reading about Zephyrian history on a data tablet. She sat beside him, her presence somehow making the vast room feel more intimate. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked gently. Jake set down the tablet and looked at her. "About us? No, about everything else that comes with us. Sometimes you could leave," she said quietly. "I would understand. The burden of partnership with me is not something anyone should accept lightly. Is that what you want?" "What I want," Lyralith said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is someone who chooses to stay, not because of what I can give them, but because of who I am. Someone who sees past the crown and the power to the person underneath." Jake reached out and took her hand. Her skin felt warm despite its metallic appearance, and he could sense the incredible strength contained within her apparently delicate form. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "But I need you to know that I'm not doing this to become some kind of galactic prince. I'm doing it because when I touched your mind, I felt something I've been looking for my whole life. Connection. Real. Honest connection with someone who understands what it means to be alone. Lyrillith's eyes brightened, literally glowing with emotion. And I felt something I thought was impossible. Acceptance without agenda. Understanding without judgment. So what do we do now? Jake asked. Now, the Queen said, we face the galaxy together, and we show them that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected places. Outside the library windows, the 3 moons of Zephyria were rising, casting their silver light across the capital city. Ships from dozens of species continued to arrive, bringing diplomats and dignitaries who wanted to witness this unprecedented union between human and Zephyrian royalty. But inside the quiet library, 2 beings from vastly different worlds sat together, planning a future that neither could have imagined alone. The galaxy might see it as a political alliance or a cosmic accident, but Jake and Lyrillith knew it was something simpler and more revolutionary. 2 lonely souls who had found each other across the vast darkness of space. The royal wedding was scheduled to take place during the convergence of moons, a celestial event that occurred only once every 57 years, when all 3 of Zephyria's moons aligned perfectly in the sky. Representatives from over 300 species had confirmed their attendance, making it the largest gathering in galactic history. Jake stood in his preparation chamber, looking at himself in a mirror made of polished crystal that seemed to show him from angles that shouldn't be possible. The formal robes the Zephyrian tailors had created for him were beautiful, but felt strange against his skin. They seemed to shift color based on his emotions, currently cycling between nervous blue and determined gold. Lord Zenthar entered the chamber, carrying a small device that hummed with energy. The final security briefing, he announced. We have intelligence suggesting that several factions plan to disrupt the ceremony. Some see your union with the Queen as a threat to the established order. What kind of disruption? Jake asked, turning away from the mirror. Political protests, certainly. Possibly attempts to embarrass you or the Queen publicly. The Krugan delegation is particularly unhappy about being passed over. There are also concerns about extremist groups who view any mixing of species as dangerous. Jake nodded. He had expected something like this. What do you need me to do? Be yourself, Zenthar said, surprising Jake with the advice. Over the past weeks I have watched you interact with our people, with visiting diplomats, with the media. You do not pretend to be more than you are, and somehow that has won you more respect than any amount of political maneuvering could have achieved. The ceremony was held in the Palace of Starlight, a massive structure that seemed to be carved from a single enormous crystal. The interior could hold 50,000 beings comfortably, and every seat was filled. Jake could see the distinctive forms of Altarian scientists, Krugan warriors, Valdris telepaths, and dozens of other species he couldn't identify. As Jake walked down the ceremonial aisle, he could hear the whispered conversations in 100 different languages. Some guests were clearly skeptical about the union, while others seemed genuinely curious about this human who had accomplished the impossible. Queen Lyrillith was waiting at the altar, dressed in robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself. She looked like a goddess descended from the heavens, but when Jake met her eyes, he saw the same person he had come to know over the past weeks, someone who had carried the weight of an empire alone for 3,000 years, and was ready to share that burden with someone who understood her. The ceremony itself blended traditions from both their cultures, Zephyrian rituals involving the exchange of crystallized light, and human customs like the exchange of simple metal rings. Jake had insisted on including the human elements, not because he wanted to impose his culture, but because he wanted the union to represent both of them equally. When it came time for the traditional speeches, most guests expected formal declarations about political alliances and mutual benefit. Instead, Jake spoke simply and from the heart. I'm not here because I think humans are better than other species, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the crystal chamber. I'm not here because I want power or wealth or status. I'm here because I met someone who touched my heart in a way I never expected. He turned to look at Lyrillith. 3,000 years ago, you took on the responsibility of ruling an empire. You've spent all that time putting the needs of others before your own, making difficult decisions that affected billions of lives. You've been a queen, a leader, a symbol of strength and wisdom. But today you're also just Lyrillith, and that's who I'm marrying. The crowd was unusually quiet as Jake continued. I know some of you think this union is strange or wrong. You might be right. But sometimes the most important connections happen between the most unlikely people, and maybe that's exactly what the galaxy needs right now. Not more division between species, but more bridges. When Queen Lyreleth spoke, her words were equally personal. For 3 millennia, I believed that my role required absolute solitude. That connection would weaken my ability to make the difficult choices leadership demands. Jake has shown me that the opposite is true. Real strength comes not from isolation, but from understanding. Not from ruling over others, but from standing beside someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay. The formal exchange of vows was interrupted when a group of Krugan delegates stood up and began to leave the ceremony. Their leader, General Thokak, announced loudly that the Krugan Empire would not recognize a union that elevated primitive humans above superior species. The vast chamber erupted in murmurs and arguments. Several other delegations seemed ready to follow the Krugans' example. Jake felt the moment slipping away from celebration toward political disaster. Queen Lyreleth raised her hand for silence, and the crystal chamber amplified her gesture into a visible wave of light that commanded attention. General Thokak speaks of superiority and primitiveness as if they are absolute truths. But what have our advanced civilizations truly accomplished? We have built great cities and powerful ships. We have mapped the stars and unlocked the secrets of matter itself. Yet for all our advancement, we have failed at the most basic challenge of intelligent life, learning to understand each other. Her voice carried across the chamber with the authority of 3,000 years of rule. A human succeeded where all others failed, not because humanity is superior, but because Jake Morrison approached my tests without the arrogance that blinds so many advanced beings. He offered connection instead of conquest, understanding instead of domination. General Thokak paused at the chamber's exit. Pretty words, Your Majesty, but when your empire faces real threats, will human weakness serve you as well as Krugan strength? Jake stepped forward before Lyreleth could respond. General, I've never claimed to be stronger than a Krugan warrior, but I've learned something in my life that might be useful. Real strength isn't about how much weight you can lift or how many enemies you can defeat. It's about how you handle the things that can't be solved with force. And what would a human know about handling impossible situations? Jake smiled. We're really good at it, actually. Humans have been dealing with problems that seemed impossible our entire history. We're not the strongest species or the smartest or the most advanced, but we're stubborn and we adapt and we don't give up. Maybe that's exactly what the galaxy needs right now. The Krugan general studied Jake for a long moment, then looked at Queen Lyreleth. We will see, he said finally, and left with his delegation. The ceremony continued, but the mood had shifted. Instead of a simple royal wedding, it had become a statement about the future of galactic civilization. When Jake and Lyreleth were finally pronounced as partners for life, the cheers from the crowd were mixed with thoughtful silence from others who were reconsidering their assumptions about humans and their place in the galaxy. The reception lasted 3 days, with celebrations spreading from the palace to cities across Zephyria, and eventually to worlds throughout the Empire. Jake found himself in countless conversations with beings who wanted to understand how a simple human had accomplished something that had seemed impossible. On the final night of the celebration, Jake and Lyreleth stood alone on a balcony overlooking the capital city. The 3 moons hung perfectly aligned overhead, casting silver light across the crystal spires and floating gardens. Do you think we did the right thing? Jake asked. I mean, beyond just us. Do you think this will actually help? Lyreleth leaned against him, her presence warm and comforting despite the vast differences in their biology. Change is never simple or quick, especially on a galactic scale. But yes, I believe we have started something important. For the first time in centuries, species are questioning their assumptions about superiority and inferiority. They are talking about cooperation instead of just competition. And what about us? What happens now? Now we build a life together, Lyreleth said simply. We rule an empire, guide a civilization, and try to be better partners to each other than we ever could have been alone. Jake looked up at the aligned moons and thought about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a lonely asteroid miner with no prospects beyond the next shipment of ore. Now he was married to one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, living in a crystal palace, and somehow had become a symbol of hope for peaceful cooperation between species. It was overwhelming when he thought about it too much. So Jake did what he had always done. He focused on the next step. Tomorrow there would be meetings with advisors, decisions about empire policy, and the complex work of learning to govern billions of beings. But tonight there was just him and Lyrelith, two souls who had found each other across the vast darkness of space. "I love you," he said quietly, words that carried weight beyond their simplicity. "And I love you," she replied, her voice filled with wonder at the truth of it. Below them, the city celebrated into the night, and across the galaxy, the news of their union continued to spread. Some species saw it as inspiration for their own relationships with other cultures. Others viewed it as a dangerous precedent that threatened the established order. But in a crystal palace on Zephyria, a former asteroid miner and an